Section 1. The Quiet Foundation of a Ghost. I remember the exact weight of the lens in my palm. It was no larger than a shirt button, cold, calculated, transparent. I didn't install them because I was suspicious. That's the lie people tell themselves later to justify the invasion. I installed them because I am an architect of systems. I like to know how things work when I am not in the room to influence them. My wife Elena always called me the steady hand of our marriage. She praised my ability to remain calm while the world burned. What she didn't realize was that my calmness wasn't a personality trait, it was a strategy. The house was too large for two people. It was a colonial-style fortress on the edge of the suburbs, filled with expensive echoes and polished marble. I spent 16 hours a day at the firm, building structures for people who had more money than sense. Elena spent her days curating our life. Charity galas, interior design consultations, yoga retreats. We were the perfect couple on paper. We were a high-yield investment, but lately the returns felt hollow. I placed the first camera in the study, hidden within the recessed lighting of the bookshelf. The second went into the kitchen, tucked behind the molding of the espresso station. The third, and perhaps the most intrusive, was in our bedroom. I told myself it was for security. We had assets. We had history. But as I sat in my office late that Tuesday night, staring at the grid on my secondary monitor, I knew I wasn't looking for burglars. I was looking for the woman I had married 10 years ago. Because the version of her that greeted me at the door every evening felt like a rehearsal. The screen flickered to life. The resolution was terrifyingly clear. I watched Elena walk into the kitchen. She didn't know I was watching. Her posture changed. The bright, performative smile she wore for the world and for me was gone. Her shoulders slumped. She looked tired. No, she looked bored. She poured a glass of wine, but she didn't drink it. She just stared at the liquid, swirling it slowly, her eyes fixed on the reflection in the dark window. I stayed silent because I wanted to see the cracks. I wanted to see the person who existed in the gaps between our conversations. For 3 days, nothing happened. She read. She napped. She spoke to her mother on the phone about curtains. It was mundane. It was safe. I almost felt guilty. I almost felt like a voyeur who had wasted his time. I considered uninstalling them on Friday. I had the ladder ready in the garage. But then, at 20:14 p.m. on Thursday, a car pulled into our driveway. It wasn't the car I recognized. It was a silver sedan, unassuming and dusty. Elena didn't look surprised. She didn't check the peephole. She opened the door before the driver could even ring the bell. I realized then that my steady hand had missed a heartbeat. My wife wasn't being robbed. She was hosting a guest I hadn't been invited to meet. The man walked in with a familiarity that made my skin cold. He didn't take off his shoes. He didn't look around the foyer with the awe that most people did when they entered our home. He walked straight to the kitchen island and sat down. Elena didn't pour him wine. She poured him coffee. Black, 2 sugars. She knew his order. I watched the screen, my breath hitching in my throat. This was the moment the architecture of my life began to shift. I didn't feel anger. Not yet. I felt a profound sense of observation. I was a scientist watching a specimen. They didn't touch. They didn't kiss. They just talked. The audio was muffled, a low hum of intimacy that the small microphones couldn't quite sharpen. But I saw her face. She was glowing. She was animated. She was present. That was the moment I understood that I was a stranger in my own home. I was the benefactor, the provider, the steady hand. But I was not the inhabitant of her inner world. I watched them for 2 hours. They looked at papers. They laughed over a tablet. It looked professional, yet it felt like treason. When he left, he touched her elbow. Just a graze, a lingering bit of friction that stayed on the screen long after he disappeared. I sat in my office until 9:30 p.m. When I finally went home, Elena was waiting. She had prepared dinner, roast lamb, rosemary. The house smelled like a domestic sanctuary. She kissed my cheek. She asked about the Henderson project. She was perfect. She was a lie. I looked at her, searching for the glow I had seen on the monitor. It was gone, replaced by the matte finish of a dutiful wife. "Everything okay, David?" she asked, her head tilting slightly. "You're very quiet tonight." "Just thinking about foundations," I said. "Sometimes you don't realize how much weight a structure is carrying until you see the stress points." She smiled, a thin, elegant curve of the lips. "You always worry too much about the things people can't see." I stayed silent because I knew exactly what I could see. I had the footage. I had the data. But I didn't have the why. I decided then that I wouldn't confront her. Not yet. Confrontation is for the weak. It's for people who want immediate emotional relief. I wanted something more permanent. I wanted to see how deep the tunnel went before I collapsed it. As we lay in bed that night, the infrared light of the bedroom camera pulsed silently above us. I looked at the ceiling, knowing that somewhere in the digital ether a recording of us was being stored. Elena turned away from me, her breathing steadying into sleep. She was a vault. And I had just found the first digit of the combination. The next morning, I didn't go to the office. I sat in my car 3 blocks away and opened the app on my phone. The silver sedan was back. Section 2. The Architect's Observation. The second visit felt different. The air on the monitor seemed thicker, charged with a frequency I couldn't quite tune into. The man, let's call him Marcus, as I would later find out from the registration scan I ran, wasn't just a guest anymore. He was a regular. He carried a leather briefcase today. He looked like a man with a purpose. I watched as Elena led him not to the kitchen, but to my private study, my inner sanctum, the room where I designed the skyline of the city. She let him sit in my chair. She let him place his dusty briefcase on my mahogany desk. My pulse didn't spike. It flattened. This was a violation of territory, a subtle erasure of my presence in the house. I realized that the humiliation wasn't in the act of betrayal itself, but in the ease of it. She wasn't hiding him in the basement or meeting him in a motel. She was bringing him into the heart of my world. They spent hours looking at my financial ledgers. My eyes narrowed as I zoomed in. They weren't looking at my designs. They were looking at our accounts, our trusts, the offshore holdings I'd established for our retirement. I stayed silent because the scope of the betrayal was expanding. This wasn't a simple affair of the heart. This was an audit. Elena was looking for a way out, and Marcus was the locksmith. I watched her point to a specific line item on the screen, a liquid asset account tied to the firm. She whispered something, and Marcus nodded, scribbling a note. The pressure began to build in my chest, not as panic, but as a cold, sharpening clarity. I had spent years building a fortress around her, thinking I was protecting her from the world. In reality, I had built a cage, and she had spent that same time learning how to pick the lock. The irony was beautiful in a tragic, structural way. I stayed silent because knowledge is only power if the other person doesn't know you have it, I whispered to the empty car. On the screen, Marcus stood up. He walked around the desk and stood behind Elena. He placed his hands on her shoulders. "I waited for the flinch. It didn't come." She leaned her head back, closing her eyes. He didn't kiss her. He just held her there, a gesture of possession that felt more intimate than any physical act. It was the gesture of a man who was already living in my house in his mind. "Soon," I heard him say through the tiny speaker. The word was clipped, muffled, but unmistakable. "He's so predictable," Elena replied. Her voice was different, harder, sharper. He thinks because he controls the money, he controls the narrative. He has no idea that the narrative changed a year ago. That was the moment I understood that I wasn't the hunter. I was the prey being studied. She had been observing me just as I was now observing her. She knew my routines, my blind spots, my arrogance. She knew that I would never suspect her of being capable of such a calculated move. She saw my steady hand as a weakness, a predictable rhythm she could dance around. The social imbalance was staggering. At dinner that night, I sat across from her and felt the weight of the secret between us. She was talking about a new charity initiative for underprivileged children. She sounded so kind, so maternal, so invested in the well-being of others. I looked at her hands, the same hands that had been leafing through my private bank statements 4 hours earlier. "You're staring, David," she said, pausing with a forkful of salad halfway to her mouth. "You look beautiful tonight," I said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation of a well-maintained facade. "Thank you," she said, her eyes meeting mine with a terrifyingly blank sincerity. "Is the Henderson project still stressing you out?" "You seem distant." "The foundations are trickier than I thought," I replied. "There's a shift in the soil, something I didn't account for in the initial survey. If I don't catch it now, the whole thing will tilt. It won't tilt, it won't fall down immediately, it will just become uninhabitable over time." She nodded slowly. "Then you should fix it. You're the best at fixing things, aren't you?" The status threat was clear. She was mocking me to my face, buried under layers of domestic platitudes. She thought she was ahead of the curve. She thought she had the leverage. But she had forgotten one fundamental rule of architecture. You never change the blueprints without checking the structural integrity of the person who drew them. I watched her for the rest of the evening. I watched her brush her teeth. I watched her set the alarm. I watched her set the alarm. I watched her check her phone one last time before putting it on the nightstand. I knew Marcus was on the other end of that silent glow. I didn't sleep. I went to the basement and opened my laptop. I began to look into Marcus. Not the man, but the firm he represented. I found things that Elena hadn't seen, things that Marcus was hiding even from her. It turned out that my wife wasn't the only one being played. As the sun began to rise, I realized that I had a choice. I could stop this. I could walk upstairs, show her the footage, and end it in a roar of legal fire. But that would be loud. That would be messy. That would give her the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. Instead, I decided to let them continue. I wanted them to feel like they were winning. I wanted them to reach for the prize, to feel the gold in their fingertips right before the floor vanished. I looked at the monitor one last time before closing it. Elena was sleeping peacefully. She looked like an angel. But as I zoomed in on the bedside table, I noticed something I had missed before. A small black device was plugged into the wall outlet behind her lamp. It wasn't mine. I wasn't the only one who had installed cameras. Section 3. The Mirror's Edge. I sat in the darkness of the basement, the blue light of the monitor etching lines into my face. The discovery of the second device, the one I hadn't installed, sent a surge of ice through my veins. It wasn't fear. It was the thrill of a master chess player realizing the opponent had finally made a move worth countering. She wasn't just hiding a life from me, she was documenting mine. I leaned back, my eyes fixed on the small black housing of the camera plugged in behind her lamp. I stayed silent because I needed to understand her angle. If she was recording me, she was looking for leverage. She was looking for a crack in my steady hand persona, perhaps a moment of anger and indiscretion or a sign of the very surveillance I was currently conducting. She wanted to paint me as the villain of our story to ensure her exit was not only profitable, but morally justified. It was brilliant. It was the kind of ruthless efficiency I usually reserve for my own boardrooms. I spent the next 4 hours mapping her network. It didn't take long. Elena was clever, but she was an amateur in the digital space. She had used our home Wi-Fi, hidden under a guest SSID named Smart Home Alpha. I bypassed the encryption in minutes. My pulse remained a steady 60 beats per minute. I wasn't just watching her now, I was watching her watch me. The perspective shift was nauseating. I saw myself through her lens. There I was, sitting at the dining table, looking cold and distant. There I was, walking through the hallway, appearing like a ghost in my own hallways. To an outsider, or a judge, I looked like a man who had already checked out, a husband who provided everything but gave nothing. She was building a case of emotional abandonment. She was framing the narrative so that when the silver sedan finally drove her away for good, the world would applaud her bravery for leaving the stone man. At 10:30 a.m., Marcus returned. This time, they didn't go to the study. They stayed in the living room, standing by the large, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the manicured lawn. The sun caught the dust motes in the air, creating a shimmering veil between them. I watched through my hidden kitchen camera as they spoke. "He's onto something," Elena whispered. Her voice was taut, like a wire under tension. "He mentioned the foundations yesterday. He's using that metaphoric language he gets into when he's suspicious." Marcus reached out, his hand resting on the nape of her neck. "He's an architect, Elena. He thinks in metaphors because he can't handle raw reality. Let him play with his shadows. The transfers are almost complete. Once the trust is restructured, he can keep the house and his foundations. You'll have the liquidity." I realized then that the professional help Marcus was providing was more than just legal. He was an asset stripper. He specialized in high-net-worth divorces where the goal wasn't just a split, but a hollow-out. They were planning to leave me the shell of a life, the house, the title, the reputation, while draining the marrow from the bones. The psychological pressure was no longer a weight. It was a weapon. I felt a strange sense of gratitude for the cameras. Without them, I would have walked into a trap of my own making. I would have trusted the steady hand to guide us through a rough patch, only to find the hand had been severed months ago. I stayed silent because I realized that to win, I had to become the man she was filming. I had to play the part of the oblivious, crumbling husband. If she wanted a villain, I would give her a ghost. If she wanted a man losing his grip, I would show her exactly what a slip looked like. That afternoon, I went home early. I knew she was watching the feed from her phone. I walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and let it slip from my hand. The glass shattered against the marble. I didn't move. I didn't swear. I just stood there, staring at the shards, letting the silence stretch for a full minute. I saw the movement of the curtain in the living room. She was nearby. "David," she called out, her voice a perfect blend of concern and hidden contempt. I didn't look at her. "I'm fine, Elena. Just lost my grip for a second." "You've been losing your grip a lot lately," she said, walking into the kitchen and carefully stepping around the glass. She didn't help me clean it. She just watched me. "I'll take care of it," I said, my voice hollow. That night, I watched the footage from her hidden camera in the bedroom. She was showing the video of me dropping the glass to Marcus via a video call. They were laughing, not a loud, boisterous laugh, but a quiet, cruel snicker. The kind of laugh people share when they think they've already won. "He's breaking," Marcus said through her phone speaker. "The steady hand is shaking." I smiled in the dark of my basement. Let them laugh. Let them believe the foundation was crumbling, because while they were looking at the glass on the floor, they weren't looking at the wires I was currently rerouting in the server room. I had discovered something in Marcus's own files that Elena didn't know. Marcus wasn't just helping her, he was using her accounts to cover his own massive gambling debts in offshore jurisdictions. He wasn't her savior, he was a parasite who had found a larger host. I stayed silent because the moment of realization for Elena was going to be far more exquisite if I wasn't the one to tell her. I wanted her to see the man she chose for who he truly was. As I watched them on the screen, Marcus leaned in closer to the camera. "One more week, Elena. Just one more week and we trigger the final transfer. Are you ready?" Elena looked into the lens, though she didn't know it, and nodded. "I've never been more ready to be rid of this ghost." She reached out and turned off her lamp, plunging the room into the grainy green of infrared. But in the darkness, I saw her phone glow one last time. A notification popped up, a message from an unknown number. I zoomed in. The message was a photo of me sitting in my car looking at my phone. Someone else was watching me. Section 4. The Third Eye. The realization that there was a third party involved shifted the entire structural integrity of my plan. I wasn't in a duel, I was in a crossfire. I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked on the image on Elena's screen. The photo was taken from an elevated angle, likely a second-story window or a drone. It was crisp. It was professional. I realized then that Marcus and Elena weren't the only architects in this game. Marcus was playing Elena, Elena was playing me, but who was playing all of us? The rising psychological pressure moved from a cold chill to a focused heat. I began to scan the perimeter of my own security system, looking for the breach. I stayed silent because any sudden movement now would alert the third observer. I had to maintain the persona of the breaking man. I went upstairs, my footsteps heavy, my head down. I went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and looked into the mirror. I looked tired. I looked defeated. It was a masterpiece of performance. But behind my eyes, I was calculating. The photo on Elena's phone had a timestamp. Yesterday, 2014 p.m. That was the exact moment Marcus had arrived for their second meeting. Whoever took that photo wanted Elena to know I was watching. They were feeding her the very evidence she needed to feel justified in her betrayal, while simultaneously alerting her that I was onto them. It was a classic destabilization tactic. Keep the parties fighting each other so they don't see the hand reaching for the pot. I spent the night in the study, ostensibly working, while actually tracing the source of that photo. I went deep into the metadata of the image she had received. It didn't lead back to Marcus. It led back to a boutique private investigation firm in the city, one that specialized in high-conflict asset protection. I cross-referenced the firm's client list with my own project history. My heart didn't skip, but my mind raced. The firm was on retainer for the Henderson Group, my biggest client, the project I had been stressed about. The social imbalance was now total. This wasn't just a domestic betrayal. This was a corporate coup. The Hendersons didn't want to pay the final 30% of my design fee. If they could prove I was mentally unstable or that my personal life was a liability that compromised my professional output, they could trigger a morality and competence clause in my contract. They were using my wife's affair to bankrupt my firm. Elena was a pawn, Marcus was a scavenger, and I was the target. I stayed silent because I realized the trap was far larger than a marriage, I whispered, my voice barely a breath. I watched the kitchen feed. Elena was making tea. She looked at the hidden camera behind the espresso machine. She knew it was there now. She didn't remove it. She just looked at it and smiled. A small, knowing tilt of the lips. She was playing to the camera. She began to speak, seemingly to herself, but I knew she was speaking to me. "It's a shame, really," she said, her voice melodic. "Some things are built to last, and some are just built to look like they will. You should have checked the soil, David. You always said that was the most important part." She was mocking my own words back at me. She felt shielded by the Hendersons. She thought she had traded up from a steady hand to a powerhouse conglomerate. She didn't realize that in their eyes, she was just as disposable as I was. I watched her walk out of the frame. The silence of the house felt heavy, like the air before a massive storm. The pressure was at a breaking point. I had exactly 48 hours before the Hendersons' legal team would move, and before Marcus drained the last of the trust accounts. I stayed silent because the move I was about to make required absolute stillness. I didn't reach out to my lawyers. I didn't call the police. I didn't confront Elena. Instead, I opened a new file on my computer. I titled it The Final Revision. I began to feed the footage from my cameras, all of it, into a secure, encrypted cloud server. But I didn't just upload the raw video. I began to edit. I combined the footage of Marcus and Elena discussing the asset stripping with the internal documents I had accidentally left on my desk. Documents that showed the Henderson project had massive, undisclosed structural flaws that would cost the company millions if they moved forward. It was a lie, of course. The project was perfect, but they didn't know that. And Marcus, in his greed to show the Hendersons he had dirt on me, would hand them the very files that would ruin their stock price. I was going to let them steal a poisoned chalice. As I worked, I heard the floorboards creak outside the study. Elena was standing at the door. I didn't turn around. I didn't close my laptop. I just sat there, my hands hovering over the keys. "Still working on the foundations, David?" she asked. Her voice was right behind me now. "Almost finished," I said. "I found the source of the tilt. It's not the soil, Elena." "Oh?" she said, her hand resting on my shoulder. Her touch felt like a brand. "What is it then?" I turned my head slightly, catching her reflection in the darkened window. "It's the person who drew the map. They forgot to include the hidden rooms." She stiffened. The mask slipped for just a fraction of a second. She looked at my screen, but I had already switched the display to a CAD drawing of a simple beam. "Go to bed, Elena," I said softly. "Tomorrow is a big day for everyone." She lingered for a moment, the tension between us so thick it felt like it could be carved with a knife. Then she walked away. I waited until I heard her bedroom door close. I looked back at the monitor. Marcus was sitting in his car at the end of our street. He was waiting for her signal, but he didn't see the black SUV that pulled up behind him. And I realized that I wasn't the only one who had called for backup. Section 5. The Architect's Gambit. The black SUV idling behind Marcus's sedan was the final piece of the puzzle I hadn't anticipated. I watched the thermal feed from my perimeter cameras. 2 men sat inside the vehicle. They weren't police. Their posture was too relaxed, their movements too synchronized. These were professionals, fixers, hired by the Henderson Group to ensure Marcus didn't get greedy with the information he was extracting from my life. The predators were now watching the scavengers. I stayed silent because the complexity of the betrayal had reached a beautiful mathematical peak. Elena thought she was using Marcus to escape me. Marcus thought he was using Elena to rob me. The Hendersons were using both of them to destroy my career, and the men in the SUV were there to make sure nobody left the table with more than they were supposed to. It was a perfect ecosystem of deceit. I spent the next 3 hours preparing the gift. I modified the architectural files for the Henderson project. I inserted subtle, catastrophic errors into the stress load calculations, errors that looked like the work of a man losing his mind. Then, I cross-linked these files with the logs of the trust fund transfers Elena and Marcus had been orchestrating. I made it look like I was liquidating my own company to hide a massive professional failure. To the Hendersons, this would be the smoking gun. It wouldn't just be a morality clause anymore, it would be evidence of fraud and negligence. They would pounce on it. They would use it to void my contracts and seize my remaining assets. I was handing them a grenade, and I was making sure the pin was already pulled. I realized that to truly disappear, I had to let them believe they had already buried me, I whispered. My voice sounded strange in the empty study cold, detached, like a recording of a man who no longer lived there. On the bedroom monitor, I watched Elena. She was awake. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, bathed in the blue light of her phone. She was texting Marcus. I intercepted the messages in real time. "He knows something. He mentioned hidden rooms. Is the SUV yours?" Marcus's reply was instant. "Not mine. Stay calm. The transfer triggers at 9:30 a.m. Once the money hits the offshore, we're gone. The Hendersons will handle the rest." I watched Elena's face. For the first time, I saw genuine fear, not for me or for our marriage, but for her own safety. She realized she was in a room with a man she didn't understand, being watched by people she couldn't see, and relying on a man who was clearly out of his depth. The rising psychological pressure was finally cracking her facade. She looked at the hidden camera, the one she thought was hers, and for a second she looked like she wanted to scream. But she didn't. She was too invested in the lie. She stayed silent, just like me. At 4:30 a.m., I left the house. I didn't take my car. I walked out the back through the servants' entrance, moving through the blind spots I had carefully mapped out days ago. I went to a small, nondescript storage unit I had rented under a shell company name 6 months prior. Inside was a laptop with a dedicated satellite uplink and a change of clothes. I sat on a plastic crate, the smell of dust and cold metal surrounding me. I opened the master feed. The house looked like a dollhouse from this perspective. I saw the light in the study go on. Elena was in there. She was searching my desk. She was looking for the hidden rooms I had mentioned. I watched her find the USB drive I had left in the top drawer. It was labeled Henderson Project, Final Audit. I saw her hand tremble as she plugged it into her laptop. I watched her eyes scan the rigged files. She didn't understand the math, but she understood the red highlights. She thought she had found the killing blow. She immediately called Marcus. "I have it. The proof of his fraud. It's all here. Meet me at the waypoint in an hour. We don't wait for 9:30 a.m. We leave now." I stayed silent because the trap was now shut. By taking that drive, she had just become an accomplice to the fraud I had manufactured. She wasn't a victim of a crumbling husband anymore. She was a co-conspirator in a corporate sabotage. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, I watched the silver sedan pull away from the curb. The black SUV followed it at a discreet distance. 10 minutes later, Elena's car followed them both. The house was empty. The steady hand was gone. The dutiful wife was gone. The only thing left were the cameras, silently recording the vacuum of a dead marriage. Section 6. The Weight of Absence. By 8:30 a.m., the atmosphere of the narrative had shifted from observation to execution. I was sitting in a quiet coffee shop 3 towns over, using a public VPN to watch the fallout. The transfer Marcus had been waiting for didn't happen. Instead, at exactly 8:01 a.m., I triggered a freeze on all domestic and offshore accounts linked to my name, citing suspicious activity and unauthorized access. I watched the GPS trackers I had placed on Elena's car and Marcus's sedan. They were stopped at a highway rest area. I could only imagine the conversation. The money wasn't there. The liquidity Elena had been promised had vanished into a legal labyrinth that would take years to untangle. I stayed silent because I wanted them to experience the specific kind of panic that comes when the floor you've spent months building turns out to be made of paper. Through the cabin camera I had installed in Elena's car, a tiny pinhole in the rearview mirror she'd never noticed, I saw her. She was hyperventilating. Marcus was standing outside the car, pacing, his phone pressed to his ear. He was likely calling his contacts at the Henderson Group, trying to trade the USB drive for protection. but I had already sent a message to the Hendersons' primary counsel. The message was simple. I am aware of your attempt to use my wife and a third-party consultant to subvert my contract. I have documented every meeting, every transfer attempt, and every communication. If you move against me, the fraudulent files my wife just stole will be released to the press as a deliberate attempt by your firm to tank your own project for insurance purposes. Your move. The social imbalance had flipped. The corporate giant was now paralyzed by the fear of a PR disaster and a massive SEC investigation. They couldn't use the evidence Marcus was offering because I had already branded it as their own fabrication. I stayed silent because true dominance isn't about winning the fight. It's about making the fight too expensive for the other side to participate, I thought, sipping my coffee. The liquid was bitter, but it felt grounding. Back at the rest area, the black SUV pulled up. The men I had seen earlier stepped out. They didn't look like they were there to help. They approached Marcus. There was no shouting. There was no violence. Just a quiet conversation. Marcus handed over the USB drive. He looked like a man who had just traded his life for a moment of breathing room. The men then turned to Elena's car. She rolled down the window, her face a mask of desperation. I watched through the pinhole camera. They didn't touch her. They just handed her a folder. Inside that folder was a copy of the surveillance I had gathered on Marcus's gambling debts, his other clients he had burned, and the fact that he had been planning to leave her at the airport the moment the money hit his private account. I watched her face as she read the documents. It was the most honest expression I had seen on her in a decade. The glow was gone. The defiance was gone. There was only the cold, hard realization that she had destroyed her life for a man who viewed her as a line item. That was the moment I understood that the greatest punishment isn't revenge, I whispered. It's clarity. She looked up from the folder, her eyes searching the empty air around her. She knew I was watching. She didn't know where the camera was, but she felt the weight of my gaze. She looked into the rearview mirror, straight into the lens. "David," she whispered. Her voice was broken. "Where are you?" I didn't answer. I closed the laptop. I stayed silent because there was nothing left to say. The architecture of our life had been demolished. The debris was scattered across the highway. The Hendersons were in retreat. Marcus was a marked man, and Elena was alone in a car she couldn't afford to fuel, in a life that no longer had a foundation. I walked out of the coffee shop and into the morning sun. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like an architect. I didn't feel like a steady hand. I felt like a man who had finally cleared the site for something new. But as I reached my new temporary vehicle, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the house. Someone had just entered the study, someone who didn't have a key. Section 7. The Ghost in the Machine. I stood by my car, the phone vibrating in my palm like a warning heartbeat. The alert was specific. Study motion, unknown user. I opened the feed, expecting to see a frantic Elena or perhaps a disgruntled Marcus returning for a final scrap of leverage. Instead, the screen showed a man I had never seen before. He was older, wearing a tailored gray suit that screamed, "Institutional power!" He wasn't rushing, he wasn't searching. He walked straight to the bookshelf where my primary camera was hidden and stared directly into the lens. I stayed silent because I realized the game hadn't ended at the rest area. It had merely shifted to a higher court. This was Arthur Henderson Sr., the patriarch, the man whose name was on the buildings I designed. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a father watching a talented child burn down a playground. He pulled a small device from his pocket, a signal jammer, and the screen went to static. The rising psychological pressure was no longer about betrayal. It was about survival. By threatening the Henderson Group, I had invited the dragon to my front door. I got into my car and drove, not away, but back. I didn't go to the house, but to the one place I knew would be monitored, the firm's main construction site, the skyscraper that was supposed to be my legacy. I stayed silent because when you face a predator of that magnitude, you don't growl. You wait for them to step into the shadow of the structure you built. I arrived at the site at 10:30 a.m. The skeleton of the building rose 50 stories into the gray sky, a forest of steel and glass. I took the service elevator to the top floor, the wind whistling through the open girders. I knew they were tracking my phone. I knew he would come. 20 minutes later, Arthur Henderson appeared. He was alone. No fixers, no guards. Just an old man in an expensive suit, standing on the edge of a concrete precipice. "You've been very busy, David," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. "The cameras were a nice touch. A bit paranoid, but effective. My grandson thought he could play you. He's young. He doesn't understand that you don't try to outcalculate an architect." I stayed silent because any word I spoke would be a concession. "The files you sent to our counsel," Henderson continued, stepping closer to the edge. "The ones about the structural flaws, we both know they're fake. But you're right, it doesn't matter. The mere suggestion of it would drop our stock 20 points by noon. You've held us hostage with a lie." "It's not a lie," I said, my voice flat. "It's a design choice. I built the flaws into the narrative, just like I built the cameras into the house. You wanted a way to break my contract. I gave you one. It just happened to be a way that breaks you, too." He smiled. It was a cold, appreciative expression. "And your wife?" "Elena? She's currently sitting in a police station trying to explain why she has a USB drive full of proprietary corporate secrets and evidence of bank fraud. She thinks you framed her. I told the detective she's probably right." The social imbalance was jarring. My wife was the collateral damage of a corporate war I hadn't asked for. But as I looked at Henderson, I realized he wasn't there to negotiate. He was there to see if I was still useful. "She made her choice, Arthur. She chose Marcus. She chose your grandson's promises. She chose to watch me through a lens while she dismantled our life." "And now?" Henderson asked. "What's the final revision, David? You've ruined the man she was with. You've checked the Hendersons. But you're standing on top of a building you no longer own, in a city that will forget your name by tomorrow if I pull the funding." I stayed silent because the leverage I held wasn't on the USB drive. It was in the very ground beneath us. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small remote, the same one I used to calibrate the smart glass in the penthouse. I didn't just install cameras in the house, Arthur. I oversaw the foundation pour of this building. I was the one who signed off on the seismic dampers. Do you know what happens when a system is designed to fail only under a specific frequency? The pressure was now absolute. I wasn't threatening his reputation anymore. I was threatening his empire's physical manifestation. That was the moment I understood that true power isn't about owning the building. It's about being the only one who knows which bolt to turn to make it scream. Section 8. The Final Revision. The silence between us on the 50th floor was heavier than the steel surrounding us. Arthur Henderson looked at the remote in my hand, then back at me. For the first time, the institutional mask cracked. He didn't know if I was bluffing. And in the world of high-stakes architecture, the uncertainty of a collapse is just as expensive as the collapse itself. I stayed silent because the silence was the sound of his empire's value evaporating. "You wouldn't," he finally said. "You're an architect. You're a creator. You wouldn't destroy your own masterwork." "I didn't destroy it," I replied softly. "I just made sure I was the only one who could keep it standing. You wanted a man who was predictable. You wanted a steady hand you could control. You forgot that a steady hand is also the most capable of precise demolition." I didn't press the button. I didn't need to. I handed him the remote. The codes are encrypted. The dampening system is locked. I've transferred the master control to a private server. If I disappear, or if Elena stays in that police station, the system will initiate a stress test that this building won't survive the next time the wind hits 60 miles per hour, which, according to the forecast, is Tuesday. The quiet satisfaction I felt wasn't from the threat. It was from the moral clarity of the moment. I had been humiliated, betrayed, and hunted. I had watched my marriage dissolve through a hidden lens, but I was no longer the victim of the narrative. I was the one writing the final chapter. "What do you want, David?" Henderson asked, his voice sounding older, smaller. "I want the trust accounts restored. I want Marcus gone, not just from my life, but from yours. And I want Elena released with enough money to live the life she wanted, somewhere very far from here. She wanted out. Give her the exit she deserves, empty, but free." "And you?" "I'm retiring, Arthur. I'm going to go find a place that hasn't been built yet. A place where I don't need cameras to feel safe." I walked past him toward the elevator. I didn't look back. I didn't need to see his reaction. The architecture of the deal was set. He would comply because he had no other choice. He was a businessman, and I had made the cost of my disappearance the only thing he couldn't afford. 2 hours later, I was back at the house. It felt different now. The echoes didn't feel like threats. They felt like memories of a person I used to be. I went from room to room, pulling the cameras. Kitchen, study, bedroom. I placed them all in a neat pile on the dining table, the table where Elena and I had shared 1,000 silent meals. I stayed silent because the house was finally truly empty. No ghosts, no observers, no hidden agendas. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It was Elena. The charges were dropped. "I'm at the airport. I saw the transfer in my account." "Why, David? After everything I did, why would you give me this?" I looked at the cameras on the table. I thought about the hours I spent watching her, the pain of seeing her glow for someone else, and the cold realization that I had played a part in my own isolation by being a man who preferred observation to participation. I typed back a single sentence, because I realized I was watching a woman who didn't exist, and I didn't want to be the one to keep her in a cage. I blocked the number. I walked out of the colonial fortress, leaving the keys in the door. I didn't take anything but my laptop and the steady hand that was no longer shaking. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror, not at a camera lens, but at the road ahead. The building I had designed stood tall on the horizon, a monument to a life I was leaving behind. The consequences had unfolded naturally. Marcus was ruined, the Hendersons were neutralized, and Elena was gone. Justice didn't feel like a roar. It felt like the quiet click of a door finally locking behind you. I stayed silent as I reached the city limits. I had spent so long watching the cracks in the foundations of others that I had forgotten how to build my own. But as the sun set over the highway, I realized that the best part of being an architect isn't the finished building. It's the moment you realize the site is finally clear and you can start over,